Welcome everyone to Taking a Coffee Break with JFrog. Today's guest speaker is Bill Manning. So Bill, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Bill Manning. I'm one of the solution architects over here at JFrog. I've been here for a long time, and yeah, I'm excited to be here today.
Excellent. So we're going to be talking today about SDLC management with Artifactory and how Artifactory can help with this process, which, as we know, is a non-trivial problem, right? So before we jump into where Artifactory fits into the SDLC, let's talk about the SDLC itself, and then we'll go from there into hooking into the CI/CD orchestration process and where Artifactory fits.
Excellent.
So in your own words, describe the SDLC for us, Bill. What is the SDLC?
Yeah, I mean, your software development lifecycle is probably the most essential bit of your organization, right? It's how your binaries are produced, but it's not just how they're produced, but it's the stages in which they go through, right? And what we have here is a typical, actually, a DevOps cycle. But when we start talking about actually how does it work, it's important to understand the stages. When you go through, like, say, development and QA and, say, staging and production, just, simple 4 steps. And, Artifactory is actually designed to help you maintain, monitor, and manage that. But one of the important factors of SDLC alone is the fact that you want to have consistency. If you follow things like 12-factor or multi-tier application methods, the idea is always the atomic unit, right? Whatever you're building in your development should be whether it's your CI or your developer, desktop, should be the same thing that QA is testing, should be the same thing that's in your staging, should be the same thing that's in your release. And the importance of it is the fact that it gives you a way to gauge your velocity. How are you acting as an organization? What's the ratio between what you produce in development and you get into production? And understanding that really is where Artifactory excels. And we're going to go through some things. And one of the important factors of this is that not only is it just what is produced and what is moved between these stages, but also to things like access level controls, where developers, you might want to have a little bit more freedom for them to do what they need to do. But when you pass it off to QA, you just want them to read. Right? You want them to pull down their information, but the important bit is that Artifactory is also a massive metadata manager that we'll talk about, and you want them to publish their results. And having the SDLC in place and being able to promote through those stages really helps you, because it really gives you a full bill of materials of not only what was produced, but how it was produced, what was used to do it, any testing results data, was deployed into environments, things like that. So it's really just a way for you to go in and have as much data as possible and as much cognitive abilities to go in and look at this, look at the context, and be able to make better decisions and improve the way you do things, or even just look at the way, what's my velocity as an organization, and have that bill of materials to back it up.
There's a couple of key things that you mentioned here that I really want to hook into. Now, one of the things that you mentioned was metrics, and how do we track the things that, because we're trying a bunch of different things every single day. We're trying to make improvements to our process. How do we actually measure these different changes that we've made to the process? What effect does it have, right? And one of the things you mentioned was the ratio of artifacts that make it from your dev to your production. I think that's a really important metric. So can we talk a little bit about that metric and how that helps inform us with respect to what is our efficiency, right? So how can you leverage that ratio?
Absolutely. So, by separating out your repositories, so if you're familiar with the way Artifactory operates, right, you have local repositories, remote repositories, and virtual. Local repositories are the binaries that matter to you. This will be directly reflective of your SDLC, right? Your remote repositories are the third-party transitive dependencies that you use to build that, and then virtual repositories are the encapsulation. But when you are storing stuff in local repositories and you are publishing your builds, you'll actually be promoting your builds through the life cycle. Artifactory has a very convenient API in which you can do this. This API is that when you are progressing through these stages, you have the ability to supplement it with as much additional metadata as possible to make all the context more relevant. So being able to actually go in, though, and use our Artifactory query language or GraphQL or, numerous ways to use the API to, gather the information last updated. How many binaries have been published into each one of these repos and compared to each other. So in other words, inside of development, you might produce 100 binaries. You pass it off to QA. QA might reject 99 of them, and then maybe pass one to staging. And in the staging, you might have some other stage testing, or you might do some other preparation work. And when you get to development, which is like your gold standard for what you're getting out there, you can correlate the number of actual releases in the time frame in one repository towards the number of builds in another. So this way you can say, we produced 100 builds, and we're only releasing one per each one of our sprints, or however you gauge.
Excellent.
And what's great too is, just really quick, sorry, one more thing is that, so say you are in QA, the thing is that you can see what was passed to QA, and if their QA team is passing those results inside of Artifactory, you can actually directly look at those results to see what the failure rates are, and based on that data, why the failure rate was such that it is.
Excellent. So that is something that we're adding into the QA process as well, right? Is where we're using, you're saying tracking those metrics for QA engineers with respect to what kinds of things in their testing is causing more or less failures with respect to the artifacts that are flowing through the SDLC. Is that right?
So yeah, so exactly. So you can go in and you actually, the thing is that, like I said, metadata is king, right? Understanding and having that context to make better decisions, you can base it on valuable data that you could actually garner and store inside of Artifactory. And like I said, a lot of people, what's funny is that, there's always this discussion, and Sarav and I are on the same team that we have with our customers, where we have to explain, yes, we are a binary management solution, but we're much more than that. If I were to look at it and say what we do, consistency is the #1 factor that we actually offer as a platform, right? Consistency in how things were built, between teams. Consistency in, going through the phases of your SDLC. But the thing is, it's actually an amazing, basically build management solution. Not just a place to store the binaries, but also all that data provides context, like I said, to provide consistency, to make sure that you're very consistent in what you're, producing and delivering, but also too any bottlenecks, any issues. Are you integrating security? And we'll talk about security at one point about this, where maybe you're using our X-ray product to determine whether or not there's something nefarious inside, or it doesn't meet a compliance officer's potential need that they have when making and building and doing these various components. But the data can help you build models, and those models can help you improve by identifying bottlenecks, by identifying pieces that might be flagged that need to be addressed, such as compliance issues and security issues or performance issues or whatever. But having all that information really helps out and helps make those decisions much easier, because you have data behind you to support it.
Exactly. I think one of the most difficult issues that we have to face today is this explosion of binaries, right? There's so much out there, and how do you figure out what's supposed to go where, right? Because you have all this metadata. So, what is metadata really? It's data about your data, right?
Exactly.
And there's so much data. If you need context in there's part of it which is building out that data, right? There's a lot of different systems that are building out that data. Now you have to figure out what do I do with this data? And in order to figure out what you need to do with your data, you need data about that data. That's what metadata is, right? So I want to discuss a couple of different types of metadata inside of Artifactory here, because there's metadata can be collected in a lot of different forms in Artifactory, right? In addition to things like property sets, which is a really custom form of metadata, which I can define. What are some of the other ways of getting metadata into into Artifactory, right? And primarily, I'm working with my build systems. How do I use my build systems and that integration between my CI/CD and Artifactory in order to get better metadata?
Absolutely. So one of the nice features is, as stated, is, as a besides a binary repository, we're a metadata repository for those binaries. And like you said, metadata is just data about data, right? And one of the ways you could do this is either through our API. So one of the nice features is that if you are using this for your SDLC, which revolves around your build, like I said, we have APIs. We have our promotion APIs that can actually get you between the stages. But one of the nice features is properties. So all of our binaries have the ability, because of the way we store the binaries using the checksum-based approach, that means that every binary that is non-duplicated, because we never duplicate binaries with the SHA-256 abilities, but it means that every instance of that has its own set of metadata that can be context and the relative usage of that. This also allows you to track and trace all those binaries through their usage also in many multiple projects. But in addition to that, the thing is that when you are, say, working with builds in SDLC, is that when you go in and you publish that build into Artifactory, there's a section called Release History. And in there, this gives you the ability to publish that data into that location. So when you are looking at a build object, you have one single template in which you can, if you do it right, if you publish those binaries through the API, through the promotion API, there's actually an update property API that you can do on each individual binary or build. You can actually have all that data reflected back to you. So when you are looking at a build object, you are looking at this thing you've produced, you have all that data in one location. Not only information from externalized ancillary systems, but also how it was produced, what was used to produce it, how long did that cycle take, did those other teams, publish information into it, those QA team or testing teams, what was their results, and just having all that information in a single repository location. But also too, if you do run into an issue, you could also do a blast radius. Because we know all the context about the components, you could actually go ahead and increase your speed of remediation and root cause analysis, because you have all this metadata that you can take, and thus go ahead and make, change features, change the way you're doing things, look at your procedures, even check the any of the pieces you're using. Am I using this optimally? How do you know? Well, you can use that as a correlation between your externalized systems that are running it and the actual data that's installed, inside of Artifactory, and you can correlate them together to make better decisions.
Another interesting point you bring up was blast radius and impact analysis, right? The fact that the way the industry has kind of done things in the past was that we used to have very siloed processes, right, including development and operations, right, which over time we came up with DevOps, right, and said, these things shouldn't be separate. There should be one continuous operation to go from development to deployment, right? And then from there, we added in security. Now, what does it mean to integrate security as a part of this process rather than having it as a siloed, separate task?
Absolutely. DevSecOps has now, become the most prominent feature of DevOps, right? Most people don't even refer to DevOps as DevOps anymore. It's mostly DevSecOps, because security is actually one of the most important components of DevSecOps, right? Security allows you to make sure, and especially with Artifactory and our X-Ray product, to go through and enable that level of security through the entire SDLC. So in other words, you can do everything from, say, shift left, at the developer level. If you have any security tool in development, right, during in your development or your SDLC, the most ROI you can get from any tooling is always at the developer level, right? It's much harder to address security issues further down the pipeline than it is at the beginning. So having it at the forefront is number one. Having a part of your SDLC process through those various phases is very essential too. Remember, the scale in which, or actually the lead time from the time you produce something to the time you get into production could be long or it could be short. It doesn't matter, right? There's a time frame, but that time frame can change, things can change in between there. So not only having it in the initial phases, but also say a new 0-day gets introduced halfway through your cycle, how do you know that you're not about to introduce something into production? So involving it in, say, your build process, making sure that it's there, maybe passing it from one phase to the next. You might have, maybe a staging area. When you publish, say, you do the promotion API and you promote the build into, say, your staging repository, why don't you write some rules using our X-Ray product and say, every time a new build comes in, let me evaluate it. And if it gets evaluated, maybe I flag it so it doesn't be released. Maybe it passes your staging, and now you're putting it into your production. Now in production, you could apply it there too. Let's do one last spot check before I send it into my production level environment, so I don't accidentally introduce something, that will, potentially threaten my company, both from liability, but more implicitly, financially. So having end-to-end security is pretty essential. And we've actually done a really good job of having it so that you can have it at all the stages of your SDLC to ensure that not only security, though, let's talk about compliance, because in a lot of industries, compliance is just as important as security, making sure that you're not using any sort of licensing that could be potentially threatening to the organization. So maybe somebody has a license that says, hey, this library I'm going to use does everything that my organization needs to attribute for this project. You know what? I'm just going to use it. Without reading the EULA, maybe the license agreement on it that says basically, if you use this, you need to attribute all your source code to us, and we need to be able to review it to make sure you're using us properly. Not a very far-fetched, problem.
Definitely, yeah, and exactly. I think one of the points that I really zeroed in on here was the fact that things are constantly changing, right? And we're dealing with software. Technology is changing. As we're talking, there's thousands, millions of packages being published, right? And updates are happening constantly, continuously. Things are being built and published. New versions of your transitive dependencies are being published. So as you're going through your SDLC, just because you've tested it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely you've completely handled all the every aspect of security here, right? We can follow practices like version pinning, for example, in order to help us avoid these things. But we have to be careful about the way that we implement them and making sure that they're well integrated into the process. So. Thank you so much.
Remember, it's not only. Just really quick. Remember, it's not only the dependency you're pulling. Those dependencies have dependencies, right? Look at NPM as an example. At NPM, you could define 4 or 5 transitive dependencies and bring in 500, other transitive dependencies around that. How do you audit all of them? How do you make sure that they're all not nefarious? How do you, and like you said, you mentioned version pinning. One of the features we're actually going to be introducing very soon is actually repo prioritization, to say only accept the versions that are currently here and basically flag the rest that if they're new so we can evaluate them.
Excellent. One last concept here. I know that we're just out of time here. But one last concept that I did want to get on everyone's mind is the fact that we've discussed a lot here about automation and the fact that it's a necessary mechanism in order to catch these things, right? Because it's not possible to do any of these things manually. If you try to do these things manually, you're not going to be able to, you will inevitably miss certain vulnerabilities, certain security issues that are going to come through, right? So automation is key here. And a big part of that automation are the webhooks that we supply, both in terms of the platform webhooks as well as X-Ray, right? And these webhooks will give you the ability to create some more enhanced automation capabilities and allow you to do things like hooking into the metadata that we've been talking about, right? And using that metadata in order to provide context to your automation mechanisms, right? And that is very, very important. You cannot do automation without having context. And that's what the Artifactory platform, the JFrog platform, will provide.
Absolutely, and that's a very key concept. Automate, automate, automate.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this coffee break and talking about the SDLC management.
All right, guys, have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Bill and Saurav, and thank you, everyone, for being a part of this coffee break series and for joining us for sessions throughout these 2 weeks. As we mentioned, you will receive the recording of this webinar. And if you have any additional questions or would like to book a one-on-one session with us, please feel free to reach out to us at webinars@jfrog.com. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.
Cheers, everyone. Be safe.